These are some very challenging times we're living in, folks. As you know, of course, last weekend Trump had his little parade in Washington, D.C. that was only attended by a minuscule amount of people, while millions of people were protesting him in the No Kings marches around the world. And it's amazing how in just not even 6 months' time, Trump has turned this country from a country of love and tolerance to being a laughingstock. It's like that movie, Idiocracy. And even worse is the fact that right on the same day this happened, a Minnesota state representative was murdered along with her husband. And the murderer turned out to be an ultra right-wing dingleberry who simply did not believe in freedom of speech. He was a royal trumper, and the story was he came to her house dressed up as a cop. And what happened was, it turns out that he had a laundry list of representatives and politicians who all wanted to do the same thing. They wanted to murder, he wanted to murder these people. He wanted to murder all these people, all in the name of, the right-wing bigotry that has taken over this country over the last, too long. It's so sad that we went from being a country where people were tolerant of each other, there was a lot of ideas coming along. We were going in the right direction. And then Donald Trump, he bamboozled so many people into thinking that he was the lesser of the two evils, when in fact he wasn't. And that's what happens, folks. That's what happens when I'm walking my dog at the same time. Yes. This is like the only time I can talk to you right now. So, I think what's wrong is that we have become a society that's all about misinformation and lies. And a lot of it started, I think, with people like Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. So let me give you a little history about the Federal Communications Commission. So the FCC was started in 1934. It was the invention of a guy by the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Yep, the President of the United States. He was the most progressive president we ever had, FDR. He got us out of the Great Depression. There was a reason why he served so many terms as, he was, 4 terms as President of the United States. He died in office. He fixed this country. One of FDR's ideas was creating a better way of regulating broadcasting. So he created the Federal Communications Commission. It was part of his original New Deal. So what happened was, back in the olden days, you were only allowed to own one radio station in one town, and then one TV station. You could only own X amount of radio stations You couldn't own a radio or TV station in the same market as a newspaper. I mean, some companies were grandfathered in, like Tribune in Chicago, with WGN, which stood for World's Greatest Newspaper. And then what happened was, as time went on, the FCC made more good decisions. They created something called the Fairness Doctrine in the 1940s, which forced broadcasters to have viewpoints from all sides of the political spectrum, so people could make up their own decisions. Who's the good, which is good, which is bad. And then you had the and another great thing they did in the early days of television was, in 1964, they forced television stations, all TV sets, to have UHF capabilities, because even in large markets, they only had one space for VHF broadcasts. Austin, Texas was one of them. And what happened was, believe it or not, the Austin TV station was owned by, guess who? President Lyndon Baines Johnson, KTBC TV. He also had KLBJ radio. And I believe LBJ, no joke, actually stood for Lady Bird Johnson, his wife. So KLBJ radio and KTBC TV, they were owned by President Johnson and his family. And so anyway, the good news was, now with more TV sets with UHF, it meant more choice for and it's like more choices for people. There were 3 networks back then. And what happened was, in some markets, they had to shoehorn a ton of networks onto one channel. Like in what was it? Toledo. Like, for an example, by the late 1960s, Toledo, Ohio, kind of went like this: Channel 11, WTOL, was CBS and NBC. 13, WSPD, was ABC primarily, and then NBC secondary. And then Channel 24, which was WDHO, pretty much had the rejects of 13 and 11. Well, and it was not just Toledo. Birmingham, Alabama was another example. And I believe Raleigh, North Carolina was another example. The reason why, part of it, in case of the South too, was because of racism. A lot of people said that people like Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley were all pro-democracy. They were not for segregation at all. They were about creating a level playing field for both whites and blacks and people of all races. Whereas in the South, it was all about, letting white have everything and telling the black person, you're screwed. Kind of like what the canceling of all the DEI contracts that Trump is doing right now, or Trump, I should say. So what's going on? But anyway, here's another example of the Fairness Doctrine. So what happened was, so there was a television station down south, Channel 3, it was in Jackson, Mississippi, WLBT, there we go. WLBT was owned by the Lamar Life Insurance Company. And Lamar was a company that was very pro-segregationist. They, as a matter of fact, I even heard that back in 1956, I believe, Thurgood Marshall, the future Supreme Court Justice, he had an interview with Dave Carraway on the Today Show. And what happened was Channel 3 in Jackson, Mississippi cut to black. And they put up a slide that said, sorry, cable trouble. And what happened was in this, you see, it turns out that Lamar Life Insurance Company, the folks who own WLBT TV, they were, had very close ties to white supremacy groups like the KKK. And they wanted nothing, absolutely nothing to do with African Americans. So for years, the FCC got multiple complaints from viewers, and because it turns out that Jackson, Mississippi is 50% black anyway. It was kind of a half and half split. So what happened was they got a lot of complaints from viewers, and they came to the conclusion that WLBT's license had to be revoked. And it happened in 1971. Lamar Life Insurance Company lost WLBT. It went to a nonprofit group of investors of all colors, white, black, you name it. And they owned that for a couple of years. And when they did so, they started hiring more black people to cover the news and create more of a viewpoint for all colors. And as a matter of fact, at one point, WLBT was actually owned by a black man who, of course, was also a mayor of Jackson. But the FCC had a long history of, and some of the rules were kind of weird. RKO owned a bunch of TV and radio stations, CKLW in Windsor, Canada. They lost that because the Canadian government said, yep, Canadian ownership only. They had KHJ in Los Angeles, WHBQ in Memphis, WR New York City. They lost all those stations because of bad bookkeeping. So they had to sell off all their stations. Of course, RKO was a legendary film studio too. So what happened was the FCC did put their foot down on a lot of things. And they did a lot of good stuff for the American people. It created a playing field that basically told the small, big corporations, think about the small guy too. But then I think the shit really started to hit the fan. So in the early 1970s, I think it was 1974, a radio station in New York City, WBAI, which was owned by a firm called Pacifica, played a record called The 7 Dirty Words by George Carlin. And a right-wing, devout Catholic father was driving down the street one day. Guess what happened? He was listening to it with his young son, who was like 14, 15 years old at the time, and he said, this is inappropriate to air on the radio. So he filed a complaint with the FCC. FCC slapped them with a notice of apparent liability, and the FCC, so they fought it all the way to the Supreme Court. They said that this is a violation of the First Amendment, what they're doing, because the FCC back then did not have a very specific list of do's and don'ts for broadcasters when it came to content. And people kind of had to wing it and create their own rules. And then what happened was in 1978, the FCC won. So the story was, part of the reason why the FCC won their case was because it was a 5-4 decision, and the 5 Supreme Court justices who sided with the FCC, they were all Nixon employees. Even Thurgood Marshall himself was part of the 4 who dissented because he knew how it felt to be censored, and he knew that what the FCC was up to was going bass-ackwards, and boy, howdy did it. So then we had Reagan. Ronald Reagan and his FCC. So this is what Reagan did. In 1987, Reagan's FCC abolished the Fairness Doctrine, saying that it was an outdated law. What happened was there was this right-wing talk radio host from Sacramento, California, who moved to New York City, went on WABC radio, and he got massive ratings because his entire radio program was a shit show. And people loved it. And guess who that man was? Rush Limbaugh. Limbaugh ended up with massive ratings. And, by the 1980s, most AM stations were pretty much lifeless. And many AM stations went off the air due to the fact that people loved to listen to music on the FM. And there was just no true use for AM radio except for sporting events and, senior citizen, adult standards music, Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett, and that was it. Dean Martin. Jesus Christ. So what happened was, so that's what happened with Limbaugh. He became so popular that he ended up on hundreds of radio stations. And originally his show was cheap. It was a barter program. Radio stations didn't have to pay a dime to air it. And Limbaugh made millions and had millions of listeners. But then what happened was people realized that, Limbaugh was such a big star, so out of the woodwork you had people like, Sean Hannity and G. Gordon Liddy and Michael Weiner. Of course, Michael Savage on the air, but you get the drift. And of course, even worse shows too, like InfoWars with Alex Jones. Of course, he lost that $1 billion lawsuit. The point is, right-wingers basically told liberals, screw you, you don't have a voice. Because it's, we don't care about you. We have the money, we have the power, we have 50,000 watt stations carrying our shows. And I'll tell you what happened. Up in northern Michigan, where I'm from, Traverse City and most of northern Michigan. And what happened was, a lot of people in northern Michigan have Rush's values. They're racist, they're homophobic. If some of these people see a black person walk down the street, they will run and hide or hide their purse or whatever. And what happened is WTCM 580 AM was a ratings, it was just a waste of electricity for years. And then they picked up Limbaugh. Ratings went through the roof. It was the first time an AM station in northern Michigan had massive ratings, probably since the 70s. And today, they're the only radio station in northern Michigan that actually has good ratings on the AM band. Of course, there's also WMKT, and of course, WJML is long gone. Of course, that station's been sold to a Christian group. So, long story short, Limbaugh, so the story is, things only got worse in 1996 because of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And of course, Bill Clinton signed that into law. And that meant that now, the system started to really fuck up. Now companies can own, I think in one market, it's 2 AM, 7 FM, and 2 TV stations if it's a bigger market. Smaller markets, just 1 TV station. Of course, up in northern Michigan, they worked around it by creating shell company. It's like they created shell companies to take over, the owners of 7 and 4 and 9 and 10. They created these shell companies to take over, the 2 lesser stations up north, which is 29 and 8 and Fox 32. And that's the problem. The sad truth is, the Telecommunications Act did not create jobs. Bill Clinton was not a good job creator. I mean, I've said in one of my earlier podcasts that that Bill Clinton was not a good job creator, period, end of story. And it was the same with broadcast groups. He gave power to companies like Clear Channel and Cumulus and so on and so on. And I remember back in the 90s, it was like a radio station whose signal barely kissed a major area was selling for tens of millions of dollars. Because back then, back in the 90s, we didn't have Sirius or Pandora or Spotify. We didn't have those. We had to get our music straight from the radio. And, and of course, everything changed with the internet, with streaming and smartphones. And it's just that radio became more and more lifeless as time went on. And of course, the FCC fucked up again because of the overreaction of the Janet Jackson nip slip. And all these more and more right-wing groups stepped in and said, we can't allow this filth on TV. So now, if a so-called indecent event happens on regular over-the-air TV, the FCC, what they'll do is slap that station with I think it's like $450,000 fine or whatever the fuck it is. And that's what's going on. Now, since the nip slip incident, the FCC, now thankfully, since then, the FCC hasn't created stupid laws since. I mean, it kind of ended with Obama. But the question is, what about Trump? Will he make shit tough because of Project 2025? Will he step up and say that, yes, we're going to outlaw pornography? And the question is, what kind of level pornography are we talking about? Because this is a guy who, of course, is trying to sweep under the rug the fact that he had this relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and all these pictures on the internet of him hanging out with underage girls. And this is why I hate right-wing media. It's sickening that on regular mainstream media they cry about the so-called liberal media, and the question is, what is liberal media? Whatever happened to Air America? Oh yeah, I remembered what happened to Air America. iHeartMedia, the former Clear Channel, put Air America on a lot of their stations, and then what happened was Bain Capital, which of course is that company that's headed by Mitt Romney, took over the company, took over iHeartMedia, and forced Air America off the air, and Air America ended up bankrupt. Nowadays, there's only 2 left-wing talk show hosts, as far as I know, who are still on terrestrial radio, and it's Stephanie Miller and Thom Hartmann. And Thom Hartmann, of course, he has very few affiliates on regular radio anymore because of what corporate radio did to him. Here in Grand Rapids, he was on 1680 WPRR Public Reality Radio, and his show got canceled because of what Tyrone Bynum did. Tyrone Bynum flipped the station to stupid R&B music. And then, what's even more sad is that Thom Hartmann is from right here in Grand Rapids. So now, the only true good source of left-wing talk radio or pro-democracy shows is on the internet. And that's where I step people like me and the brothers, we all stepped in. And we are forging a path that can't be done on, on terrestrial radio, because, what, let me tell you a sad story. One of my dear friends who passed away not too long ago was Mark Stacer. Mark was a former DJ in Northern Michigan. He worked at WTCM and WKLT. Mark personally told me to syndicate. Why? What's the purpose of syndication when, you're dealing with major, it's like even in Northern Michigan, the big radio groups could care less about me. Hell, one of them tried to sue me even gave me a cease and desist. Of course, that man was Roy Henderson. And he fucked over left-wing, pro-democracy talk in Northern Michigan when he purchased, 750 AM in Petoskey and flipped that to country. And of course, Rick Stone, who owned WJML at the time, he put his shows on all the, the left shows on WGML, and he phased them out. And as a matter of fact, Ed Schultz, of all people, was replaced with, surprise, surprise, Alex Jones. And look at what happened to Alex Jones. The fact that he went out of his fucking way and told, his listeners, oh, Sandy Hook is a hoax. Oh, it's all actors. I don't understand. People who are so obsessed with, right-wing media are sick. They seriously are. Many years ago, there was a man down in, I think, Alabama, who, this made national headlines. He kidnapped a little boy from a school bus and made him stay in his cellar with him. He had like this little cellar. And what happened was, thankfully, the boy was rescued. The guy went to jail, I think. And it turns out that part of the reason why he was so mentally ill was because he listened to right-wing talk radio all the time. And what's even more tragic is the right wing and all these Jeebus freaks for years and years. What they did was they said, they said the same shit about pornography and, heavy metal music. Look up, back in the 60s, there was a guy named Charles Keating, and he invested in making these porn movies like Perversion for Profit and Pages of Death. And he was telling everybody that pornography was evil and pornography is gonna kill people. And of course, one of the movies, Pages of Death, it was a movie about these two detectives trying to track down the murderer of an 11-year-old girl. And the murderer was a 16-year-old boy who had nudie magazines in his possession. And the nudie magazines were pretty much tame to, comparing to what you see on the internet these days. Folks, no lie. I started looking at X-rated stuff when I was like 13, 14 years old. How many women have I raped? 0. How many people have I killed? 0. It's all bullshit to keep your eyes away from the truth. And the truth was Charles Keating was a crook because of the, savings and loan scandal. And then you have in ditto with all these assholes back in the 80s who tried to tell everyone that heavy metal music was, pro-murder and, somebody, and the same with rap music. Folks, I can understand, there's a lot of rap music that's in hip-hop that's all about authority sucks and let's get rid of authority, and I mean that was the way it was, but they were doing this because of the way white people treated them for decades, and of course cop killer by body count, well, of course, was a song about, the fact that Ice-T was pissed off over the fact that, this police officer, these groups of police officers, they were beating the living crap out of a black guy. Rodney King back in 1991, 92. The point is, and not only that, look at Slayer. People thought that Slayer was a devil worship band for years. And the funny thing is, their lead singer is a devout Catholic. Not only that, they had that song, Angel of Death. That song is not about Satan. A lot of people say, well, it's about the devil. No, Angel of Death is not about Satan. It's about the Holocaust. You understand? Man, I don't know. The point is, I don't want to hear, well, that guy killed somebody because of what he read or what he... The truth is, right-wing media will spin and lie. And I think it's, that the FCC should have never made all these changes, because now they are creating a barrage of murderers because of people who are addicted to Fox News, people who are addicted to misinformation. Fox News, folks, paid, $787 million to that voting machine company? Because they lied. And now they're lying about the fact that they claimed that Donald Trump had a conversation with the governor, Gavin Newsom of California, the governor. That didn't happen. It's lies and bullshit to convince, to sway people away from the actual truth. And the actual truth is, Donald Trump is a bankrupter. He is a pedophile. He's a rapist. And he did it once before to our whole country. When he left the White House, folks, the first time around, reluctantly in his opinion, we had COVID. And now we have, the question is, what will this country be like when he leaves the White House for the second time in 2029? The question is, will we still have a country? The point is, people need to wake up and smell the truth. The truth is, right-wing media is not your friend. Fox News isn't your friend. Newsmax isn't your friend. Your local AM talk radio station isn't your friend. Know the difference between right and wrong. It's that simple. Wake up. All right, I've talked my piece. Have a good day, everyone. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.